Good afternoon, and welcome to our next WSRP Research Associate lecture. I am delighted to be able to introduce Susan Crawford Sullivan this afternoon. Susan is Assistant Professor of Sociology at the College of the Holy Cross, where she teaches Sociology of Religion, Catholic social teaching, and community organizing. Susan, you will note the practical bent in her work, which is no doubt somewhat attributable to her having done a Master's of Public Administration at Princeton's Woodrow Wilson School of Public and International Affairs before she came to Harvard's Sociology Department, where she did her doctorate. And she has continued refining the doctoral dissertation, for which she won a huge list of prestigious fellowships and awards during her year here as a research associate. It's been very exciting to get to see firsthand this project moving very close to publication. It goes on March 31st to the University of Chicago Press, where it is under advance contract, and we're very excited to see what happens to it there. The book has the same name at this juncture as today's talk. You never know what will happen in the next phase, but it is entitled Living Faith, Everyday Religion in Mothers and Mothers in Poverty. Susan.
Thank you, everyone, for coming. I'll just jump right in and say that there are many social science studies of low-income urban mothers and mothers on welfare, but there's a conspicuous lack of research on how they participate in religion. Policymakers and scholars note that churches are crucial resources in distressed urban neighborhoods. However, most research that's been done focuses on how churches provide social services to the poor, not how much the poor actually participate in or connect with the churches. Even less is known about how the poor practice religion in their daily lives. It turns out that low-income single mothers are less likely to attend church services. But does this mean that religion is unimportant for them? The role of religion and spirituality remains high among modern American lives. So you have a high percentage of Americans, 56%, saying religion is very important in their own lives, with women more likely to say it's very important than men. Poorer and less educated individuals are also more likely to regard religion as very important in their lives. And fully 85% of African Americans say that religion is very important in their lives. 6 out of 10 American adults say that faith is involved in every aspect of their life, and 7 out of 10 say they find purpose and meaning in their life because of religious faith. Given figures like these, why has so little attention been paid to the role of religion in the lives of mothers on welfare? Such women's lives are difficult and challenging, juggling searches for housing and decent jobs, struggling to care for children, surviving on welfare benefits, or working on low-wage service sector jobs, which often lack dignity and benefits, coping with family disruption, and possibly facing physical or mental health challenges or addictions. It seems likely that many poor women would involve faith in their daily activities and find purpose and meaning through religious faith. And I find the lack of research particularly perplexing given the policy emphasis on the role of faith-based organizations in poverty reduction. So today we'll be looking at everyday religion. Looking at religion in terms of, as Robert Orsi says, the domain of everyday existence, practical activity, and shared understandings, with all its crises, surprises, satisfactions, frustrations, joys, desires, hopes, fears, and limitations. Historian Marie Griffith, sociologists Meredith McGuire and Courtney Bender, and anthropologist Marla Frederick, among others, have produced groundbreaking work on lived religion. To study lived religion, states Orsi, entails a fundamental rethinking of what religion is and what it means to be religious. Religion comes into being in an ongoing dynamic relationship with the realities of daily life. Nancy Ammerman draws attention to everyday experiences of individual lives and the importance of understanding the social worlds where religious ideas and practices exist. Traditional ways of measuring religion, such as religious adherence and church affiliation, miss many of the religious practices that occur outside of institutions, leaving much of actual everyday religion unanalyzed. Marla Frederick contends that social scientists emphasize race, class, and gender in understanding how people navigate their worlds while neglecting spirituality. Yet, she continues, among the faith-filled, faith in God navigates how individuals respond to almost all of life's circumstances. To study the lives of such individuals without studying how spirituality operates in their lives misses a key part of both what motivates and constrains their actions. So the purpose of my project is twofold. The first is listening to mothers and trying to understand their everyday religion, hearing their voices, and I'll share a little of their voices with you here today. The second part is to further develop social science theory on religion and poverty. So everyone would be familiar with Karl Marx and religion as the opiate of the masses. We had mid-20th century compensation theory, where the afterlife compensation for the earthly misery is how the poor will be rewarded. But I'm looking at how religion can be a powerful resource for the poor. Now, social scientists have moved beyond the opiate of the masses to show religion to be a resource to marginalized people, but more in organizational studies, so looking at things like faith-based community organizing, than delving into the daily lives of people. There are some exceptions, Margarita Mooney's new book on Haitian immigrants, but research on a variety of populations, including those not involved in churches, is needed to further develop theory. While rejecting a utilitarian view that reduces religion to a mere coping mechanism, I contend that religion serves as a resource for a potentially large number of mothers in poverty, whether or not they attend church. I conceptualize religious resources as two types, institutional and personal, cultural. So by institutional religious resources, I mean resources associated with a church or faith-based organization, like pastors, networks of fellow congregants, and material aid. Of course, churches, synagogues, and other religious institutions exist first and foremost so that people can come together and worship the divine. But in addition, social scientists have found aspects of congregations to be provide important resources across a broad array of areas, ranging from the civil rights movement to mental health. In addition to church-based institutional resources, religion also provides cultural resources, the beliefs, views, and symbols that people draw on to structure their experience of the world. Sociologist Ann Swidler analyzes how culture shapes people's strategy of actions, which is a notion highly applicable to studying the role of religion in the lives of mothers in poverty. So I'll just very quickly here run through my methodology. For this study, I conducted in-depth interviews with 45 low-income mothers in the Boston area, recruited from 10 social service facilities. I wanted to recruit through social service facilities instead of churches to get a range of beliefs and practices. I didn't want to just talk to the people who were already in church. I also interviewed 15 urban pastors with combined many, many years of experience working in low-income neighborhoods. You can see, really just briefly here, the sample was a mix of, had a variety of racial and ethnic backgrounds. Almost all of the women were single, separated, or divorced. Most of these were single, never married mothers. 3/4 of the women were on public assistance at the time of the interview, and the rest had received it in the recent past. Their ages ranged from the late teens to the early 40s, with the median age of 26, and all had at least one child under the age of 6 by the way I set up the study design. You can see here the religions people identified as. A few identified as a religion, Catholic and some evangelical, Protestant, Pentecostal type backgrounds. But most of the people said they were not currently practicing a religion or they had no religion. Although in interviewing them, it was clear that these make up what sociologist Michael Hout calls unchurched believers. Most of them did. That is, 80% of these who said they had no religion say that religion is of medium or higher importance in their life. 3/4 of them pray privately, and 85% were raised in a religious tradition. I interviewed women of Protestant and Catholic background, or there were a few with no religious background. I didn't encounter in the social service agencies I was recruiting through women of Jewish or other faiths, so this study focuses on those of Christian background. You can see here that my respondents, the majority of them, had a high level of personal religiosity, prayed frequently, and had other personal religious practices. But hardly any of them attended church. Only 7 of the 45 women attended church even once a month or more. Now, survey data shows that the poor are less likely than the non-poor to participate in organized religion, but some studies show higher levels of belief and subjective religious feelings. Similar to my respondents, people having high levels of personal faith, but not necessarily involved in organized religion. So this is a paradox. And of course, some of the reasons are the same for more affluent believers. They're not interested in church, they're too busy. But in interviews, I found 2 sources of explanation that are more particularly pertinent for mothers in poverty. And I divided them into sort of 2 categories, capacity and stigma. Capacity is fairly straightforward. About half of my respondents lacked stable housing and were living in long-term family shelters. So, just issues with transportation, job schedules for those who were working, were working service sector jobs, nursing homes. They didn't necessarily have the Sundays off. Dealing with young children as a single mother. It was hard for even very religious women to get to church. Stigma is a little less straightforward because churches are supposed to be welcoming institutions. Yet 1/3 of the people I interviewed experienced stigma at church, either due to single motherhood, cohabitation, poverty, welfare, or some other aspect of their lifestyle. Now, norms, I'll just go through a few of these quickly. Norms accepting of unwed motherhood are highly prevalent in poor urban communities. However, non-marital fertility goes against the norms and values of a number of churches, particularly conservative churches, and single mothers may sometimes find themselves feeling unwelcome. So, just put up a quote. I'll read it as well, but if anyone wants to look at it. This is Lisa. These are all pseudonyms. A white single mother raised Catholic. The church I grew up in disappointed me, so I don't want to go to that church no more. The priest told me that it takes a man and woman to conceive a child, and it takes a man and a woman to raise a child. That's the first time I swore at somebody of the cloth. I feel bad for it, because I do believe in God, and I do believe in what I was taught. But don't tell me it takes a man and a woman to raise a child, because it doesn't. I told him that's where he was wrong, because my mother raised 3 daughters by herself. We came out pretty damn good. I need to find a church I'm comfortable with before I go back. Now, none of my African American respondents experienced negative incidents due to single motherhood or otherwise believe that churches look down on single mothers, suggesting that single motherhood is less stigmatized in black churches, which actually other studies have found to be true. In terms of cohabitation, I'll give you the example of one of my respondents I call Maria, a 24-year-old young woman on welfare with 3 small children living in a family shelter, and in many regards a highly religious Pentecostal. She prays throughout the day, reads her Bible several times a day. She follows all the Pentecostal norms, which I was actually unaware of these norms before I was interviewing people, but she doesn't wear jewelry, she doesn't wear makeup, she only wears skirts, she only listens to religious music. And she used to be very involved in her congregation, attended all the time, received a lot of practical support as a single mother on welfare when people would take her into their homes, give her food, as well as spiritual and emotional support. But when she moved in with the father of her 3 children into the family shelter, she was no longer welcome to continue attending her congregation. She says, "We are not married. We live together. I just like to call him my husband. My religion says that 2 people should not be living together if they are not married. We have to get married in order to go back to church." So single motherhood, cohabitation. Other reasons for stigma I found some respondents feeling an internal sense of stigma. They would describe themselves as sinners and feel unworthy to go to a church. And then I also found poverty and welfare, people feeling unworthy because of their clothes not being nice enough or not feeling like they had enough money to put in the collection, even being on welfare. And all of the pastors that I interviewed were aware that this kind of stigmatization took place, either in their own congregations or in others, due to either lifestyle or poverty. And one pastor of a working-class African-American church told me that some of his church members don't want the poor. And he said one woman said to him, "Reverend, why is it that that's all we can attract, the alcoholics and the drug addicts and the people who just got out of jail? What can they do for us? I mean, they can't give us collection. They are uneducated. So what can they do for us?" And so he continued. He said, "There's an issue among church members," he said, "that we've struggled long and hard and we've managed to make it and you haven't, and that's your shame. There's a sort of element that we want to keep away from our children. We don't want that here." So that's a little bit about capacity and stigma. I'm going to turn to talk about religious coping and religious coping theory, looking at religion as a resource for facing challenges, whether or not you're involved in a church, and religion as an interpretive lens for viewing the world. So studying primarily non-poor people in times of sickness or crisis, psychologist of religion Kenneth Pargament finds that people are more likely to turn to religion during times of greatest stress, when events seem out of control. This would describe how many single mothers on welfare often feel. Pargament finds in drawing on religion, people often use what he calls a collaborative religious coping style, which is the most prevalent way that I've found low-income mothers to draw on religion in facing challenges, seeing themselves as working together in partners with God. Mothers who believe they work in partnership with God to solve problems describe the concrete actions that they take, while also relying on prayer. So Maria explained how she worked with God to deal with a crisis housing situation. She says, "When I had nowhere to go and I would ask God, please, if you're not doing it for me, do it for my kids. I don't want my kids to be sleeping in a car. I never got to that point because God was always there to help me. When I had nowhere to go and there was nobody who could take me into their house for any other reason, the only thing I had in mind was to go ask for help from the government. And that's what I did, and they got me a place, and here I am." This was in the shelter where I interviewed her. But she perceives the partnership with God to have brought the results, that God put it in her mind to go and meet with the government. So although the women are the ones taking actions like filling out housing forms, job application forms, or seeking government help, they believe it's the partnership with and assistance from God that brings results. Collaborative religious coping is not just waiting passively on God. Prayer yields hope and produces perseverance and strength to take action. There's an extensive literature on religious coping, although it doesn't much address the urban poor. I actually prefer to use the term resilience and use the language of resilience and agency instead of coping. And although, as used in the religious coping literature, the term coping does incorporate concepts of resilience, the word itself doesn't evoke what I found among the women I interviewed. So I looked in the thesaurus for synonyms for cope. They were survive, manage, deal with, get by, muddle through. Instead of coping, I would describe religion's positive impact on low-income mothers better by the term resilience. Resilience recognizes the strength, perseverance, creative problem-solving, and strong sense of self-efficacy that religion can provide to disenfranchised women. So now, having laid a little groundwork, I'm going to turn to 3 important sites of everyday religion for low-income women. Work and welfare is the first one, parenting is the second, and the third is making meaning of circumstances and suffering. So to start with work and welfare, welfare has been intimately connected with issues of morality in recent decades in the United States, where welfare recipients are viewed as women living a cultural pathology of laziness and promiscuity. By using welfare benefits, mothers fail to live up to societal norms of responsibility and self-sufficiency, exhibiting moral degeneracy by heedlessly breeding and bearing children they cannot support, societal attitudes that led to the 1996 welfare reform. Given these connections between between welfare and morality, it's not surprising that low-income women make connections between religious beliefs and attitudes toward welfare. The religious authorities mothers cite with regard to welfare vary. Most women cite God, conveying what they perceive God would think about welfare. Others cite their religious tradition, their pastor, their church, their congregation, as a source for their religious ideas about welfare. Most of the women I interviewed believe that God, church, religion, however they're conceiving of it, view short-term use of welfare positively, but would disapprove of long-term welfare use. So Rhonda, I'll tell you, an African-American single mother who had previously been on welfare before getting a social service job, draws on both her congregation and what she thinks would be God's thoughts about welfare as she describes her views. And she thinks that religion views short-term welfare use positively. She says, for those who want to better themselves but are just stuck right now, just to do things to help yourself in a positive way, whether it be go back to school, get a trade, look for work that's going to pay you in your career. But for people not trying, I think the church would shun them. For people making welfare their career, and this is the line I thought was really interesting, God made somebody think of welfare reform. And it helped because, you don't have people making a career out of the welfare system. A minority of my respondents thought that God or religion would disapprove of welfare altogether, no matter what. So Rebecca is a white Catholic mother who attends Mass about half the year as she has to walk with small children and she has no transportation, so she doesn't go when the weather is bad. And she told me, God would think I'm a bum for not working. I feel guilty when I think about religion and taking. Like having the Sunday, the Sabbath day at rest for prayer, for thankfulness. I feel bad. I feel like even if I go to church, I'm not doing anything for myself. I don't belong there. That's how I feel. Interestingly, in an era of working motherhood and welfare reform, about a third of my respondents thought that religion disapproved of working mothers, whether or not they themselves agreed with this assessment. So some disagreed. Like there was a respondent I called her Marilyn. She had moved from welfare to work as a union painter, a very good paying job. Definitely a success story in terms of welfare reform. But she said the Catholic Church in which she was raised would disapprove that her daughter was in daycare and would want her to stay home. My respondent, Marilyn, disagreed with this, but she said she still felt guilty internalizing these church attitudes. I did find some respondents who agreed with their perception that the mothers shouldn't work. This mother here, Jane, a mother of 4, a white evangelical, God ordained it that the mother should be with the children, raising the children, not somebody else raising the children. I think that God would rather have a mother be on welfare and stay home with her children because that is the most important thing, the mother raising the child. But given welfare reform time limits, most women will work. So the question of everyday religion becomes, how does faith enter into their work lives? Now, since Weber, sociologists have sought to discern how religion impacts work. Contemporary scholars find a weak connection between religion and economic behavior. However, a number of studies find that religion plays a role in the meaning people attach to their work. Faith provides work with a sense of meaning. Survey data shows that about 1/3 of working Americans think a great deal about how to link faith and work. Robert Wuthnow, who's done the biggest study, a big national study on this topic, he concludes religious commitment has come to play a kind of therapeutic role in relation to economic behavior in post-industrial society. Rather than providing guidance, religious conviction provides meaning. That is, work becomes more interesting because it has cosmic significance. Now, these studies are on higher income people than my respondents. I found 2/3 of the women in my study connect faith and work. And remember, only 7 attend church even once a month or more. Unlike previous research, where the main role of faith or spirituality at work is to contribute a sense of meaning, the main role of faith at work for my respondents was to help in dealing with the stresses of their jobs. And I had so many people talk to me about this. I just pulled up a couple of sample quotes. If I get lazy or something, I pray to God to give me strength to go on. Or if I feel like I want to quit, I pray to God to give me strength not to quit. And if I feel like I'm running into a fight with one of the employees, I pray I'll get some self-control. This second quote, it was from a Latina 17-year-old mother telling me about her recent job in a toy store. Oh God, please help me through the day, survive the day. I usually work with customers and that's not easy. You have to ask for help. When people have a bad day, they take it out on you. You can read the last one. And I would just point out none of these three particular respondents go to church at all, yet faith played an important part of their everyday work lives when they were working. Mothers find faith to be a powerful tool in helping them to deal productively with rude customers or difficult bosses or coworkers, helping them carry out unpleasant tasks and complete the work they need to accomplish. A sizable minority of my respondents connected faith with workplace ethics, as surveys show higher income people do as well. So these women emphasized not stealing from employers, not lying. Peggy, a white evangelical who no longer attends church services, explained how her faith kept her honest in a previous house cleaning job. She says, you feel a lot of temptation to do bad things, to help yourself to people's things, or just do a slipshod job in cleaning and grab the money and run. I never wanted to do that because I always knew that God's eyes were watching me, and I wanted certainly to please Him, Maybe because I feel God's watching. I would never touch anybody's things or give them less than I had promised them to, because I think that maybe God had put that in my head. But the primary role of faith at work was to aid in survival in the low-wage workplace. Although the majority of women were receiving public assistance at the time of the interview, few were long-term welfare recipients, and many were involved in job training programs. According to them, neither God nor churches wants people living off the system. Although often stereotyped as lazy, many mothers on welfare have internalized the Protestant work ethic, whereby hard work pleases God. Low-income mothers believe that hard work pleases God even if the jobs are bad. Theologian Miroslav Volf critiques a Reformation-based theology of work which sees opportunity to glorify God in all work. Volf argues that this understanding of work suggests that all jobs are places to serve God, which acts only to ennoble dehumanizing work, when instead it should be improved through structural changes. Volf's critique applies to the religious vision of work that I uncovered among low-income mothers. The women's views do not reflect a religious vision that would call for social change or improved opportunities. In fact, when directly asked what they thought religion or God might require of employers, most responded with some version of the supervisor treating them nicely and with respect. And only one mother out of 45 mentioned decent wages and benefits. Turning to parenting, another key site of everyday religion, the second key site I'll talk about. Parenting is challenging under the best of circumstances, and mothers on welfare face similar challenges to their middle-class counterparts in balancing working with caring for their families, yet do so with far few marketable skills and resources. And although scholars have examined a number of ways that poor single mothers try to manage parenting, there's very little research about religion. General studies show that parents look to churches and synagogues and other religious organizations to teach children traditions, reinforce morals and values, and to provide a community. These studies of non-poor families show that parents most value the family cohesion provided both by churches and religious practices in the home. So I wanted to look at what very poor mothers might want out of religion for their children. And it turns out that most of the women, 37 of the 45 women I interviewed, wanted their children to have strong personal religious faith. And they had a couple of main reasons. One is for their children to derive self-confidence and comfort from the fact that God is with them and that they're never alone. They also think that religious faith will enhance children's self-esteem and provide them with moral guidance to resist peer pressure. Women also pray for themselves as parents. So remember, these are almost all single mothers, many themselves raised in troubled circumstances, and they pray for help in parenting. This phenomenon is most vividly illustrated in the case of Vicky, a Native American Catholic who stopped attending church when she perceived a priest's homily to vilify single mothers. Although she doesn't attend Mass, she relies on her high level of personal faith and knowledge of religious culture to help her parent. She says she wants to raise her young son in a happy, well-balanced home, which she did not have growing up with two alcoholic parents. And I'll just let you read this for a minute. So she's saying, I don't know the right way to parent. I know the wrong way to parent. And so I ask God for help a lot. In addition to personal faith and help in parenting, mothers also want their children to be in churches, even if they themselves do not attend. 32 women also wanted their children involved in churches, including 70% of those who never attended themselves. A number of my respondents actually sent their children to church with other people or by themselves and didn't themselves attend. And urban pastors that I interviewed confirmed this phenomenon, saying that about half of the children in their churches were unaccompanied. In churches, mothers seek for their children protection from the street, adult role models, and community. Mothers in poverty thus emphasize somewhat different things in terms of what they seek from religion for their children compared to more affluent parents. Some things are the same as previous studies. They want churches to teach children traditions, reinforce morals and values, and to provide a community. But issues of self-esteem and protection from the street, which dominate poor urban mothers' discourse on religion and parenting, do not find a prominent place in existing studies of non-poor families. And I'll give you the case of Chantel, a woman I call Chantel, an African-American mother of 7. And she feels like she's a sinner, so she does not go to church anymore. But she sends her children without her. She says, I want them to know right from wrong. I want them to know what's good and what's bad. And then she talks about little children, her daughter's age, getting mixed up in the streets. Churches teach the Word of God. They teach you what's right and wrong. You don't hear them preaching saying, I want to go rob me a bank. I want them to know God and to believe in God. So that's parenting. Turning to the last site of everyday religion that I found to be very prominent among the women I interviewed is the idea of making meaning out of suffering, making meaning out of difficulty. And I'll give you the background of one of my respondents, a woman named Peggy, 39-year-old white evangelical who stopped attending the church where she was very involved when it was unsupportive during her divorce and judgmental. And she's actually never gone back to any church since. And she went on welfare for the first time after an unplanned pregnancy in her late 30s. And she told me, I see how my second child was of God's planning, because I was never planning a pregnancy at that point in my life, but I see how much joy He brought and how God knew I was going to lose my mother. And I think He gave me my son to kind of, not to fill the void, but certainly to keep me going, and give me perspective on His plan for my life. I've seen how the world views women on welfare, and maybe someday I can come back. When I'm successful, and I plan on that, come back and talk to them and say, don't ever let them beat you down. You get what you need, whether it be emotional or training, or you make yourself whole because it's not hopeless. You can do it. It's hard, but you women are tough. You're tougher than the majority, the ones who are doing it with their spouses and have never had a lot of struggle and strife. They don't have the same kind of character that you have, and that's a treasure too. So, I don't know. I guess there's a plan or vision through on my journey, my path God gave us and wanted. So you can see that viewing her troubles through the interpretive lens of her faith leads her to draw quite different conclusions about the events than an outside observer might predict. Theodicy has been an important question for classic social theorists as well as theologians. So you have Max Weber, Peter Berger, say that theodicy addresses the problem of meaning. Religion functions to create an interpretive framework for making meaning out of suffering, creating an ordered world that is significant and meaningful. In a recent essay, Mark Scott calls us to turn from macro-theodicy to micro-theodicy, acknowledging that meaning-making only occurs in social contexts. He argues for a vision of theodicy as navigation, which attends to individual narratives of suffering. By focusing on individuals' unique social location and life experiences, we come to understand their theodicy. These notions of narrative and meta-narrative provide an excellent framework for analyzing how mothers in poverty try to make coherent religious meaning out of their lives. And by attending to their experiences and on narratives of meaning-making, we can come to understand their theodicy from the ground up. In my interviews, about 60% of the women, the majority, offered a theological interpretation for their suffering, unasked. From mostly Christian backgrounds, they drew upon Christian meta-narratives of divine will and redemptive suffering. None of the religious explanations offered by my respondents are limited to people in their social situation and are, in fact, common religious ways of interpreting suffering. Listening carefully to their narratives, however, allows a window into how their theodicy is lived and experienced in a social context of family homelessness and severe urban poverty. So the first way that I found people to interpret suffering, actually very common, the most common way women viewed their hardships, was seeing them as part of God's larger plan for good. So when viewed through the interpretive lens of a loving God with an overall plan for good in their lives, then becoming homeless and having to move to a shelter with your family becomes part of God's plan to bring about good for them. So one mother, I called her Aletta, a Latina, black, mixed-race, Seventh-day Adventist woman who had stopped attending church services when she moved into a long-term family shelter. She felt her stint in going to, several different hotels and homeless shelters with her family being homeless for a good while was part of God's plan, because she ultimately, with the help of shelter social workers, got a bigger apartment than the one she had lost. So she saw homelessness as part of God's plan. Another mother, Jane, a non-attending white evangelical who I mentioned before, for her, she said, becoming homeless has offered her many new opportunities to minister and witness about her faith in Jesus to the other staff workers, the residents, and me as I interviewed her. She is not merely making lemonade from lemons, but instead has profoundly reconstructed and reinterpreted the traumatic event of family homelessness as a special calling and an opportunity for her to serve as God's minister to others. The second way that I found people to interpret suffering was seeing suffering as an opportunity for growth and character development. So in one classic view of redemptive suffering, God uses suffering for our good to help believers become more holy, more conformed to the character of Jesus. Suffering brings about spiritual maturity, hope, and perseverance. And so you see this, it's in the New Testament. Pope John Paul wrote about it in his 1984 document on the Christian meaning of human suffering. The Apostle Paul writes about suffering to his followers, extolling the benefits that suffering produced, encouraging them not only to persevere, but to rejoice in their sufferings. Looking at it from the point of view of psychology of religion, Kenneth Pargament finds that reinterpreting trauma as an occasion for spiritual growth is a common religious attribution for suffering. So difficult events which seem to make no sense are transformed into opportunities for people to more deeply appreciate life, to grow closer to God, or to help others. And I'll let you read that from Peggy, from the opening part of this section. So she's trying to look at her stint on welfare and all the suffering that she has experienced as an opportunity for character growth. She says that welfare mothers have a strong character through struggle that wealthier mothers don't have, and that's a treasure that they possess. Framing suffering as an opportunity for character development moves from a stance of questioning God from why me to what do I need to learn from this. Women believe that difficult times are actually the times in which strong characters forged, virtues like patience, perseverance, and empathy are developed. And then finally, the classic Christian interpretation for redemptive suffering is that of sharing in the redemptive suffering of Jesus on the cross. Again, in Pope John Paul II's letter on suffering in the New Testament, you can find this. And I think I'll skip over those references to just jump right to my data and say that drawing on a religious cultural repertoire that includes a focus on Christ's suffering, some poor mothers of deep Christian faith imbue the suffering associated with poverty and homelessness with a higher meaning. So this is Jane again, saying, God says you have to deal with all trials and tribulations, so things happen and you do have to suffer. I believe you suffer, that God suffered for us. He came here for us and died for us, and that's part of walking the Christian life. It's not easy. It's not an easy life to live. And she goes on, you can read it here, to sort of not only think about Jesus' suffering on the cross, but to think about the suffering of all of the early Christian believers and the apostles and how much hardship they experienced. And she interprets her homelessness and poverty as sharing in this suffering of Jesus and the early Christians and uniting her more to Jesus. Clearly, the women I interviewed held very individualistic notions of suffering, i.e. they became homeless because it was part of God's better plan for them, or so they could have an opportunity to develop their character or grow in their faith, not because they lived in an expensive city that lacked enough housing for low-income families. Feminist, black, and liberation theologians have strongly critiqued the notions of redemptive suffering from which poor urban mothers draw. Womanist and mujerista theologians critique traditional notions of redemptive suffering, saying that they glorify suffering in ways that are especially unhelpful for black and Latino women, and they inhibit social action and social change. For very poor single mothers, however, overwhelmed with daily concerns, lacking stable housing, struggling to care for their children, disconnected from churches and other civic organizations, the transformation of suffering they seek and experience is in the realm of personal concerns and not in social action. And furthermore, the view of suffering held by feminist and other liberationist theologians are not part of their religious cultural repertoire. So in this regard, I found women find their traditional interpretations of finding good out of suffering to be helpful to them, helping them to be more resilient and able to act in the midst of oppressive circumstances. That is, their theodicies are on the whole helpful in dealing with their immediate problems. Women draw strength from believing that God will work through their circumstances to a good end, or for the particularly devout, consciously uniting their sufferings to those of Jesus and the early Christian believers. These beliefs can provide them with comfort, hope, and the ability to persevere and take action in dealing with difficult situations. Now, this is not to suggest that I found their explanations for suffering to be unproblematic or that social change is unimportant, but just to highlight that from their point of view, very marginalized women perceive and experience theodicies of redemptive suffering as positive resources in helping them in the immediate circumstances of their everyday lives. Just to conclude, here, everyday religion is important for many mothers in poverty, including those who don't attend church. Faith can provide hope, resilience, persistence, and the ability to act within an oppressive social situation. It can also result in identity transformation. Women can see themselves as loved by God, not scorned welfare mothers. And I didn't have a chance to get into this tonight, but part of the book manuscript looks at faith and identity, finding that religious identity as women loved by God can counteract negative self-images drawn from negative societal stereotypes of women on welfare. But on the other hand, religious guilt or feeling that you're a sinner, oneself as a sinner, can work in the opposite direction, playing into rather than counteracting negative stereotypes. However helpful women find personal prayer, it still leaves them fundamentally disconnected from a network of religious support that may help with practical or emotional problems. And the counterexamples posed by the few mothers in my study who were involved in churches make clear that personally religious poor women who are embedded in supportive religious communities, underline supportive, have far greater religious resources available to them in confronting their challenges. In other words, social capital, which is a word used by social scientists, and there's a lot of social science studies here about various benefits to congregations for people who are religious, various outcomes. Theologian Brent Coffin writes about the transformational interaction that can come about between people in congregations. Sid Verba and his colleagues write about civic skills, that it's one of the few places that low-income people have to acquire civic skills, like running meetings and things like that. Opportunities to participate in faith-based community organizing efforts, Richard Wood's book. So I guess I would just finish with some questions about implications for churches. Given that congregations can provide a strong site of social capital and often are the only strong institutions remaining in urban neighborhoods, how might churches better strategize about how to better welcome and meet the needs of low-income women such as those who I interviewed as congregants and members and not just as social service recipients? And I wouldn't say the disconnect is all in the churches in any regard. Women's lives are very busy and cultural barriers keep them away. And I wouldn't suggest proselytizing or thinking of churches as panaceas for poor women's problems, but perhaps there would be a way to allow more women who are already personally religious but feel disconnected from organized religion to participate. My research and other studies show that churches may be unwilling or lack the capacity to reach out more. There's also implications for public policy and policymakers with the promotion of faith-based social services in terms of just awareness of the disconnect between a considerable number of the urban poor and churches in their neighborhoods. I think I'll stop here and would welcome any discussion, feedback, or questions. Thank you. Yes, Marie.
Sure. So thank you so much. This is fascinating, and I can't wait to read your book, teach your book. I think this is so important and so interesting. So I have two questions, and if you don't mind, I'm going to ask them together, because in my middle-aged memory, if I only ask one and then you answer it, I won't remember what my second one is. But my first question is, I very much appreciate the emphasis on resilience, on agency. Mm-hmm. You know I do. I mean, I very much do. At the same time, it seems to me that your own data shows that, or suggests, and I should ask this as a question, but what I heard was also that religion seems to, yes, it creates a sense of contentment or satisfaction with one's circumstances, placing them in larger meaning, which is wonderful. Does it also, though, and I just want to know, prevent people from also working to change those circumstances? So, for instance, I didn't hear in your descriptions of the women the kind of activism that Marla Frederick's women are inspired to engage in because of their faith. Mm-hmm. So that there's not that partly faith is also inspiring them to fight racism, to fight against the circumstances that keep them down. So I guess I'd love to ask you that. And if that's the case, then I guess I would say that sort of bleaker side, I hope also comes out in your book, or that maybe you have a sort of critique there as well. So that's my first question, just to ask you about that. And then my second question is that it felt to me a lot of that religion here seems to mostly mean church and congregation on the one side, or it means a personal relationship with God, prayer, and individual. And I wanted to know if there's something in between that your women are involved in that sustains that faith. So, for instance, and again, I guess I think of Marla's work and much else, and this is what I saw with the women I was studying too, is all of these informal networks of women often, not necessarily only women networks, men may surely be involved in that too, that are bringing that resilience, that hope to one another where they don't find it in the congregations, or they don't hear it preached from the pulpit. So I guess I'm interested in the in-between that there might be between the church on the one side and that individual relationship. And could that also come from pastors making pastoral visits, which I hope surely they still do? Is it, or are there women's groups that you see that hold? Otherwise, how do the women who aren't going to church, a huge percentage, hold on to that just in this individual relationship? So I'd love to hear more about your findings there.
Well, to speak to your first question, I mean, this is something I've really wrestled with as a longtime teacher of community organizing. And, my heart is in the activism side of it. But I would say that the women that I studied don't have that activism. And at first, I think they're just so disconnected from civic organizations. Like, if you look at Marla Frederick's, they're already together in a church. They're in kind of the community organizations to support the schools. And they're, banding together to go down to Washington, D.C. and, protest. I forget what they were protesting, but they were protesting something on a bus in Washington, D.C. I think the women I interviewed, half of them are living in long-term shelters. They're not involved in churches. They're really very disconnected civically. And I think if you look at Richard Woods or Mark Warren's work on faith-based community organizing, it comes from people coming together, and it often comes out of congregations. And the mothers that I interviewed, I found it disturbing that they didn't see structural explanations for their situations. So they, would talk about God wants them to work hard and not, we need higher wages. So they just viewed things very individualistically. And then I was also thinking, realistically, these are people who are really trying to survive day to day. Where's my next meal coming from? How am I, going to get my kid in this daycare so that I can go to this job training program? And, is it realistic, for us to expect them to also be down at City Hall, protesting about, poor job conditions? I don't know. To me, where does the prophetic voice of the church come in there?
Absolutely. And I'm not saying we should be out there doing it, but it does shift to me the sense of religion always having these. I felt like your image of what religion's doing for them, is kind of uniformly positive. And I'm with you in the resilience and the hope. I'm only just saying there are other things that it might not be doing for them. I don't mean that we stand in judgment over that.
No, I think you're right. I don't think religion is necessarily holding them back. I just think they think as Americans so individualistically that they're not thinking of any structural explanations for their situation. So they're not thinking of more justice-based structural religious solutions to their problems either. And then your second point, the link in between prayer and church, I looked at that, because of Bob Wethnow's work on the small group movements and stuff, and he said they cut across all socioeconomic classes. But I actually found very little evidence of participation in small groups. Maybe one woman might be in a depression support group and one was in a 12-step, but I found very little evidence of alternative communal religious gatherings. And one report, I think 2004 report on the black church, said that many of the urban poor would be unfamiliar with the idea of a church-based spiritual support group. And also given that, I think Wethnow finds that 2/3 of these groups are attached somehow to churches or religious organizations. If women feel distanced from those organizations, they may also feel distanced from church-based support groups. Now, I think they're, in terms of informal, yes, people spiritually encouraging each other. Women would tell me about their boyfriend's mother or their grandmother, people that would spiritually encourage them, and they would do the same for each other. But I think the question there remains, is that kind of informal spiritual encouragement replace the social capital that a more communal, more formal communal religious gathering might? Yes.
I have a question about how you saw your role as an interviewer in this situation. Because you're recruiting women to social services agencies rather than churches, so you can get a broader religious spectrum. You're recruiting women who are meeting on a regular basis with social workers who are sort of instilling a certain discourse, a certain script about what are the right ways to speak about sort of Protestant work ethic, or what are the right ways to perhaps express views of parenting or guilt over parenting. Was there a point where you were sort of pushing back against what your informants might be giving you, sort of what they thought you wanted to hear? How did you work with that and deal with that, since you are interviewing a lot of women who are in long-term shelters and have had a lot of these types of interactions?
Mm-hmm. Well, I mean, then that's always an issue when you're interviewing people, right? Like the interviewer bias or the respondent bias. I forget the social science term for it, but I mean, I have to say, I don't know. And I told this to some other people the other day, but I had a situation where I ended up having to bring one of my own young children along with a childcare fall-through situation to be watched with the respondents' children. This happened early on when I was interviewing, and it really changed the tone of the interview, and I actually began to bring this child along regularly with me to play with the respondents' children, because they related to me much more as like another mother juggling work and family, and less as university researcher and respondent dwelling in a shelter. I mean, we had really good conversations, and people would say, things, it's a short presentation here, but I mean, I definitely spoke with people for whom religion didn't play a role in their lives, or that religion caused guilt, or, I have to say there's no good answer to that question. It's a good question, but you do the best you can, right? Mm-hmm.
I'm actually interested in knowing how, if you have a number, how many of the Latino women or other women you interview are actually immigrants, or were they all Native American, born here in the United States, and whether or not that may have affected maybe some of their knowledge about some of the social services available to them, or whether language was a barrier, for example, things like that.
Well, no, I know a little Spanish, but I had to interview people that.
For them accessing resources, whether that might be, at least like knowing from my own background, from my parents, that was often an issue in terms of knowing how to navigate the system.
Mm-hmm.
It's so unfamiliar, and you don't speak the language, so it seems like that's another barrier to any kind of mobilization or planning.
Yeah, and I mean, some of the congregations, like the woman that I call Maria, who was unwelcome to continue attending once she moved in with the father of her children. I mean, that's a Latino congregation, where the services, it's Pentecostal, but services conducted in Spanish. So I think people do find religious homes. In terms of accessing social services more broadly, I wasn't really interviewing that much about that, so I'm certain that would be a barrier, though. Yes?
I was interested in the way that I feel like your data showed this woman kind of internalize what it really is, this double message about motherhood.
Mm-hmm.
Since welfare reform, you're supposed to be working as a mother, on the other hand, you're supposed to be home with your kids. And so your data sort of has some women who, think it's really wrong and not. And I was wondering, did you find women who would actually at least, acknowledge or feel that staying home with kids was work? That they found it to be work, or how much do they internalize, that sort of new message that we're supposed to be somehow doing it all while taking care of young children?
Yeah, I mean, I have to say, none of my African American respondents thought you should stay home. They thought that working honored God, and that was part of being a good mother. About half of my white respondents felt that, and Latina respondents. In terms of internalizing it, I mean, some people did. One woman I'm coming to mind when you're saying this, she said that she thought God would be disappointed in her for being on welfare because he would look down and see her not having a job. But she said, but I do have a job. I have a big job taking care of my son. So she was almost kind of trying to defend herself to me against what she would think God would think of her negatively. So yeah, I mean, women on welfare struggle with those ideal motherhood images all the time, I believe. Yes?
Would you your devotional practices, or how faith was coming into the house? Was it, through the television, it was Bible reading, the radio, other ways they were doing that, or like you said, the grandmother?
Yes, I did look at where religious culture came from, although I forgot to specifically ask about televangelism. Some people mention it in the interviews, but not very many. Bible reading was much more pronounced among women from, like, Black Protestant, Pentecostal, evangelical churches. And people would quote scripture verses at me. People talked about religious pamphlets. Most people, prayer was the primary devotional practice, like it is for any religious believer. Yet sacred reading did play a role in the lives of some. And then, networks, friends, childhood socialization. Research shows childhood socialization is a very important part of religious, transmission of religious culture. So that clearly played a role. Images, one woman was telling about her grandmother's holy cards that she still had. So a variety of influences, I would say. And many people had been involved in churches in their adult lives. Some people had stopped, within the past few years after some disappointing event at their church, feeling stigmatized, moving to a long-term shelter that wasn't located near their church, and they didn't have transportation. So even though people were disconnected from churches when I interviewed them, it didn't mean that 3 years ago they hadn't been involved in a church. So some of them had active, pretty recent religious knowledge from that.
Mm-hmm. Can you ask any questions about reproductive health, given that low-income women have disproportionate access to reproductive health services, and just how sometimes religious views can play into reproductive choices?
No, it would have been an interesting study, but I didn't know.
It's a different study.
Yeah, no, I didn't.
If maybe there could be some recommendations made to churches about how to deal with reproductive health issues, especially for low-income women, because that might be a stigmatizing factor for some women in going to church.
Yeah, that could be. Yes.
I was curious about, sort of in the larger context of faith-based initiatives, how some of the women in your study, you touched on it a little bit, but how they related to churches as social service sites, or other kind of like parachurch ministries, and what your thoughts were from the data that you've gathered and your larger body of research that you're drawing on, how they how women, and how maybe more so too, like how the community in general sort of sees the role of a church, the rhetoric of urban churches, the kind of social services that they provide, and where they connect, and what you said, the disconnect is where that's happening at, given that there's a lot of money going, perhaps not as much as it should be, but there are a lot of resources that are being funneled through faith-based institutions and initiatives.
Yes. Well, that's a very big topic, but just to speak briefly to it, as you are aware, I'm sure, Obama is continuing on with the faith-based office and is a strong supporter of faith-based initiatives. And a recent survey showed the majority of Americans to believe that churches and religious organizations were better providers of certain social services than the government or nonprofit organizations. Currently, about 7% of congregations receive federal grants for their social service ministries, or receive government money for social service ministries. I find, let me back up. A study that was done in Pennsylvania found that churchgoers are more likely to go to churches for social services. So large faith-based organizations, like things like Catholic Charities or Salvation Army, that doesn't matter if you go to church or not. People will go to those regardless. But to actually go to churches for social services, regular churchgoers are more likely to turn to churches. And I found that in my interviews, where few of the women actually used church-based social services. And I did ask women what they thought about increased government funding of faith-based social services through congregations. About 25% said that it was a good idea because churches were more compassionate and more human and could work with mothers on welfare better. But the majority were suspicious because they were, I had some great quotes. I wish I had them. One woman said, my pastor drives a fancy car now. Can you imagine what he and his wife would be driving if the government gave them all this money? I mean, they were really suspicious about accountability. One said, well, they're not going to put out a community organizing flyer and, tell everybody in the neighborhood. It's going to go to them and their members. So there was a lot of kind of hesitation and fear about that, I would say. Okay. Okay.
This was just wonderful, Susan, and it's been a really rich conversation. Thank you all for your contributions, but thanks for this wonderful work.
Thank you.